Mrs. Hackney smiled briefly and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Chersom. What we're going to do is have a meeting with the whole Blue team right now, just across the hall in the media center. We are going to stay focused on the facts, and we are going to point out the mistakes that have been made. We are going to make it clear that this kind of behavior cannot and will not be tolerated again. And to emphasize the seriousness of this matter, Mrs. Chersom, I have decided that Nora Rowley and Stephen Curtis are suspended from school for 2 weeks, effective immediately." My first thought was for my mom and dad. Mom gasped and then sat there like a statue, her back straight and stiff, and I could see the beginning of a tear at the corner of her eye. Dad's face showed pure disbelief. I felt terrible for them. And then I saw Stephen sitting there trying to get his mind around what that meant. Suspended from school for 2 weeks. His face was pale, and both his mom and dad were looking right at me. There was no doubt in anyone's mind I was the cause of this whole mess, and that's how I felt too. I imagined that what would happen at the beginning at the big team meeting. There would be a long lecture with Mrs. Hackney shaking her finger a lot, and Mrs. Chersom would be frowning at her friends and threatening to kick everyone else out of school, just like they were suspending Stephen and me. And of course, Merton Lake would be sitting there the whole time with a smug little smile on his face. Awful. And there was nothing I could do about it. Fact. Once a plan starts to collapse, it comes crashing down fast. All you can do is try to jump out of the way. And sometimes you can't. Mrs. Hackney was about to say something else when Mrs. Byrne raised her hand. The principal said, "Yes, Mrs. Byrne?" Mrs. Byrne stood up and smoothed out the front of her skirt. "Mrs. Hackney, I need to say something. I do not agree with this punishment." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was strong. "I think that the motives of Nora and Stephen should be taken into account here. The things they did may have been naive, and they have certainly caused some problems for Mrs. Noyes and Mrs. Zhang and our fellow teachers. But these two weren't simply trying to stir up trouble. And what they've been doing has absolutely nothing in common with vandalism, Mrs. Chersom. Vandalism is mindless and destructive, and what Nora and Stephen have been doing is anything but that." Mrs. Hackney stood up and leaned forward with both her hands on the table. "That's quite enough, Mrs. Byrne. This is neither the time nor the place for personal opinions." But Mrs. Chersom held up a hand. "It's all right, Mrs. Hackney. We have nothing to hide here. Our school district has always been a place for free and open discussion. So please continue, Mrs. Byrne." Mrs. Byrne nodded at the superintendent and said, "Thank you. As I was saying, these are good kids, and their motives were good. These students were simply trying to get everyone to look more closely at some of the negative side effects of testing and grading. The teachers at this school and at every other school in our town have raised the same kind of concerns, and teachers all across Connecticut have pointed out that this focus on test scores is unhealthy, especially the CMT scores. Nora has experienced these issues firsthand, and she's intelligent enough to have noticed the problems. And she and Stephen have been brave enough to try to do something about it, braver than some of the rest of us have been. So I want to go on record here. I am flatly opposed to these suspensions, and I think that many of the other teachers in our schools, and perhaps a good number of the people in the town of Philbrook, would agree with me." When Mrs. Byrne was finished, Einstein would have loved it. It was like that timeless moment before the Big Bang. Then the universe began to explode. There was a short burst of applause from Mrs. Zhang, and Mrs. Noyes got up from the table and walked over to stand beside Mrs. Byrne. They were fellow teachers, like Mrs. Byrne had mentioned, and teachers stick together. My mom stopped holding her breath. My dad nodded at Mrs. Byrne and said, "That's right. Maybe Nora's onto something here," which got him a gentle shush from my mom. Mrs. Curtis patted Stephen's arm, and Stephen began to get some color back into his face. Then my mom and Mrs. Curtis started talking back and forth above my head. Stephen's dad took out a handkerchief and blew his nose, and then wiped his forehead, which was the wrong order, if you think about it. Merton's mom had one eyebrow lifted, and she whispered something in her husband's ear. Merton sat there with a twerpy grin on his mug, and he tried to catch my eye, but I ignored him. Mrs. Hackney tried to keep her face muscles under control. In the middle of the noise and chatter, she kept saying, "Let's stay focused, people." The superintendent looked around and kept her lips pulled back in a tight smile, but her eyes told the real story. I could see her imagining what might happen if this issue broke loose and started bouncing all over town. The school secretary had given up trying to take notes, and when she started talking with Mrs. Drummond, words and phrases floated across the table. "Really? Oh, yes, because on Monday it was only—" And when she told me that, "No, you're kidding. Yes, I heard that too." Dr. Trindle just smiled and tapped his fingertips together. The psychologist was enjoying himself. And me? I was trying to see everything at once. Then I looked at Mrs. Byrne, and she was in her chair again, her hands folded in her lap. We exchanged a look, only for a second. A lot was said in that glance. It was not a kid-to-teacher moment. It was person to person. Finally, Mrs. Hackney pushed her voice up an octave and said, "Come to order, please. Everyone, please quiet down." And when the room was quiet, she said, "Thank you. Now I have an idea or two, but perhaps our superintendent should give us her thoughts first." Mrs. Chersom kept her smile locked in place, but I could tell she had no clue what to do. Again, her eyes gave her away. I could see her problem. Everyone could. If she took too strong a stand, she might have a real rebellion on her hands. And if she took too weak a stand, then she could lose some of her authority. Mrs. Chersom said, "Well, I really think that, all things considered, we should try to handle this at a district level. This is a local school issue, and since you're the principal, Mrs. Hackney, I think we should hear your ideas first." It was another Einstein moment, time and space suspended, all eyes on Mrs. Hackney's face. Everyone could see what was happening. Two powerful, intelligent women were each scared to take the next step. And I felt bad for both of them. After all, I was the one who had gotten everyone into this mess in the first place. I wish I could help them. Then something began happening, something new. I've always been the light bulb girl. Thoughts would come blasting out of nowhere, like a lightning bolt on a sunny afternoon. Boom, and I'd have a new idea. This was different. An idea was definitely coming, but softly. It was like I was looking at a broad green lawn, and then there was a passing cloud or a shift in the wind, and every blade of grass snapped to attention, sharp and crisp. And there across the lawn I could see the footsteps of an idea, a simple path, and I could see it had always been there, and the path was for me. All I had to do was the next good thing. I raised my hand. Mrs. Hackney had never been happier to call on someone. "Yes, Nora?" I didn't know why I stood up before I started talking, but I did. I said, "If it's all right with you, Mrs. Hackney, I'd like to talk to the whole blue team. I think I need to say something to everyone. And then, whenever you and Mrs. Chersom decide to do about punishments and everything, that'll be okay with me." And instantly Stephen stood up and said, "Me too." There we were again, equal partners. Mrs. Hackney looked from Stephen to me and then turned to look at Mrs. Chersom. Mrs. Chersom turned to look at me, and then she looked back at Mrs. Hackney. And then Mrs. Hackney looked at me again and said, "That sounds like a reasonable request. I think we should all walk across the hall to the library right now." It must have felt like a reasonable request to everyone, because the whole room seemed to heave a sigh of relief. As people started getting up and moving toward the door of the office, my dad leaned my way and whispered, "I sure hope you know what you're doing." I whispered back, "Me too."